All right. Hello, everyone. A very good evening from Mumbai to all our viewers. We are back after a brief hiatus, and it feels great to be connected with all of you again. Now, it seems that COVID is determined to test our resilience, and we must remember that our strongest attack is in our defense. So, as we go back to our work routines and other things, please do not let your guards down. Follow safety protocols and keep everyone safe. Extremely important for all of us to get that message. Now, with that said, give us a shout out if you and your dear ones are all safe. You know the drill. Post your message in the comment box if all of you are doing good. Now, tell us which city and town you are logged in from. A guest speaker would love to know that. Tag your colleagues, friends, relatives, anyone you want to join the session today with us. Don't forget to post your questions. The two lucky questions will be rewarded with Amazon gift vouchers, but for that, you will have to stay with us till the end of the session. So keep your questions coming. And lastly, if you missed our previous sessions, so don't fret. You can find the recordings of all our previous sessions on our website, social channels. Make good use of your time and browse through those sessions and see what interests you. I can assure you that there is enormous wisdom out there on the take. So that brings me to our current session. We are living in unprecedented times, as all of us know, and this kind of adversity can cause significant amount of stress to anyone. So the need for us is to avoid that burn to get to us, and more importantly, for us to get more resilient. Now, I haven't done this, but if I was to sort of look at all the news articles in the last 6 months and sort of make a word cloud out of it, and I'm sure when I do that, fear, stress, anxieties are going to be some of the words that will really pop out of the cloud. And that's pretty much our reality. So, our guest speaker for today, and I'm happy to welcome Tamryn Batcheller-Adams, has done exceptional work in bringing out best in people. She has a master's degree in counseling psychology, and she's working as an independent consultant with Tomorrow Today Global. She co-designed, coaches, and facilitates in senior leadership program in the US and South Africa, and her work centers around team development and individuals to bring the best out of themselves and their teams. She will be joining us from South Africa today. So thank you very much, Tamryn, for coming on the show and joining us, and welcome to Master Speak. We are all ears now from here on.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. It is such an honor to be here. So I'm going to jump right in and share my screen. Okay. All right. I'm trusting that this is visible to everybody. I've lost, obviously, now my visual ability to see any comments or chats, but I hope that, as Rakesh said, that you will continue to put questions or comments as we go through this topic. And what an incredibly important topic it is. I was saying to some of the organizers of this that this is a topic that, despite me having done it for many years, in the last 3 months, in fact, even in just the last month, I've noticed that it's come up more and more and more, probably more than I've ever seen it in my entire career. And as Rakesh highlighted, we're living in incredibly uncertain, unprecedented times where those word clouds would produce words like stress, exhaustion, unhappiness, fatigue. In fact, in a previous seminar that I did last month, we did a word cloud specifically to ask people how they would describe the world at the moment. And those were the kinds of words that were generated, as well as a few swear words, which probably wasn't very appropriate. But nevertheless, it really does convey to us that this is our current context. It's a time of difficulty. It's a time where people are feeling emotionally and mentally fatigued. And we need to think about how to bolster people's resilience or capacity to cope in this very, very uncertain and turbulent world at the moment with COVID. So, as Rakesh said, I'm a psychologist. I have worked extensively with individuals and with organizations to help bring out the best in people. And a lot of the work I do is with senior leadership in terms of executive coaching and thinking about how do we build emotional intelligence. And if we think about the current crisis, emotional emotional intelligence is one of the key characteristics that is either helping organizations get through if their leaders have it, or it's holding organizations back when their leaders don't have it. So that's a little bit of my background. Welcome. I know it's evening for you. It's late afternoon for me here in Cape Town, South Africa, but it's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for the opportunity. So let's dive in today. I think the important thing to start thinking about before we get onto anything about burnout or resilience is the understanding that we all view the world differently. And the reality is that we don't see the world as it is, but we see the world as we are, because our childhood experiences, our developmental years have shaped and molded our perceptions. And that's why sometimes you can be sitting in a boardroom or you can be sitting in a meeting and think, why can't that person see it? Why can't they understand what we're trying to do? Why can't they be normal just like me? And I very often say that it's those three words that are the problem. Just like me, because people aren't just like you. They are going to have completely different worldviews and experiences or perceptions shaped by their culture, shaped by their context. So I can say that until I'm blue in the face, and normally everybody nods along, and unfortunately I can't see your reactions, but I imagine you're probably nodding along. But then the moment you go back into a work dynamic or even with the social group and someone kind of comes at loggerheads with you, you forget that idea and you just get frustrated with them. So I thought, let me think of how I can put this practically. Have a look at the screen that you can now see. It's just a screen filled with different colors in the sense that they're black and white, and there's some specific shapes on that screen. I want you to see how many of the coffers, and coffers are those square-like shapes that almost look like ceilings because they're kind of rectangles within rectangles. So one of them would be one coffer with those multiple rectangles in it. How many coffers or squares can you see in this slide? I'll give you a few moments so that you can count them up. All right. Generally, people say anything north of 20, depending on how much of the screen you can see, depending on how much of the screen is blocked by my face or the chat. But between 20 and 34 is generally the answer that we get. And that was probably fairly easy for you. This was an experiment that was done by a group of professors who were looking at trying to experiment with foreground and background thinking. And so what they did is that they showed this to a group of 1,000 participants in terms of a study sample, and they asked them a similar question around the depth perception of these squares or these coffers. Out of that 1,000 people, 106 people came back and said, but we don't see the squares, we see another shape. Now I've probably got your attention, because there's actually another shape that is very clearly displayed on this screen. Count how many circles you can see. Yep, you heard me right. That wasn't a break in the feed. I want you to have a look at how many circles you can now count on the screen. And I'll give you a few minutes to try and see if you can work that out. You're welcome to pop it in the chat as well, just to see if other people can start to see the circles. Perhaps maybe an easier question is, can you see the circles in the screen? Perhaps not. Well, let me help you out. There's a circle. There's a circle. There's another one and another one. And now you can probably see how they formed, and that actually they are all over the screen, almost as many circles as there were squares or coffers. And so now you're probably wanting to kick yourself a little bit, but the purpose behind this was not to make you feel silly or make you realize that there are other things that people can see that you can't. The idea was really just to highlight that, again, when you are looking at something, your experience of it is going to be shaped and nuanced by what you can see, and that might be completely different compared to what other people can see. What's interesting about this experiment is that they realized these circles, this mystery around depth perception and what people see and what others see, quite by chance. It was a completely accidental experiment, but it highlights really well that our perceptions are heavily influenced by our own experiences. So if we were to hold that in mind, I think this is the one line that I'd like you to almost take out of this presentation, that we don't see the world in the same way, and therefore we don't experience it in the same way. So when we come to a year like 2020, which has been so chaotic for so many people, but not necessarily for everyone, we have to factor in that actually we haven't all experienced COVID in the same way. Some people have been devastated by this year so far. Other people have actually found success in this year. Their companies have flourished because they've been centered on online deliveries or a service that has actually been allowed to continue despite the different lockdown regimens. Some people love a challenge, and so their personalities thrive in this kind of context. In fact, some of the leaders I've worked with have told me that they've wanted to galvanize their workforce because this is a time to kind of band together, whilst other leaders have really experienced an almost sense of paralysis in terms of how to go forward. So we don't experience the world in the same way, and we're definitely not going to have experienced COVID in the same way, depending on our personal and professional context. If we think about the psychological impact of change, and change is something that we are all going through all the time, take a moment and think perhaps about the last time you left a job or got fired from a job. The general pattern to cope with change is a 4-week, 6-week, 3-month process. The first 4 weeks, when you start with something new, it feels chaotic. You almost feel like you're drowning. You don't know where things go. You don't know who to ask. And anyone who started a new job can attest to that. By the 6-week mark, you normally start to feel a little bit of a sense of self-competence, because now you're kind of not asking the same questions all the time. You're able to know where one of the two things that you need are. You can begin to troubleshoot. And by the 3-month mark, people are normally settled into a new position, whether that's work or family life, or they've moved countries or homes. There's a sense of stability around 3 months. This is the process that actually is happening on the undercurrent in terms of your own psychology. When you are ending something, there's a decrease in your emotional energy. So you normally go through anxiety, shock, confusion, depending on the context, maybe anger or avoidance. Then you go into what they call the reorientation process, which is where you kind of almost come to terms with the fact that things are not going to be the same. You've reconciled that, and there's this idea of I need to move forward, but I'm not always entirely sure how. And so there's often a high level of energy, although it's not very directed energy. It can also result in quite high levels of stress because you know that change needs to happen, but you're just not sure what the next steps are. And then you move into that third level of change, which is where the new change itself starts to emerge. And with that, there's often a lot of anxiety. It can feel a level of impatience, but essentially you're working towards a position of acceptance around what is new and a recommitment to something that is very consistent and stable. And so you can see the emotional curve that you go through, which starts with denial, anger, and shock, and ends on something far more positive around enthusiasm, trust, excitement, and hope. I think the real difficulty, or perhaps the real tragedy of COVID this year, is that this cycle hasn't really come to full fruition. Because there are multiple waves of this disease, there are multiple different levels of lockdown. Your area or your community might be in one level of lockdown 1 week, and then that changes and then it oscillates back. I'm noticing that a lot of people around the world, and I work with leaders from 30 different countries, are just consistently oscillating between this different pattern and these different emotions, which makes it emotionally exhausting because you're never getting to that level of, okay, I've got to something new and now this is going to be stable. The idea of stability or hope, as it's mentioned there, is something that hasn't really been afforded to a lot of people this year. And so I wanted to show you this because I really want you to highlight, or I want you to be able to see why this change, why these transitions are so much harder than maybe changes that you've been through in the past. But even if we were to focus on just change itself, we need to acknowledge that with every change, there is a sense of loss. Even the changes that you've wanted, changes like getting married or moving country, starting a new job, ending a relationship, starting a new relationship. Every single change, by virtue of the transition itself, comes with a loss, even the losses or even the changes that you were looking forward to, because that's the nature of transitions. So if we had to think about in a particularly difficult COVID year, where there are these multiple oscillating changes all the time between working at home, working in the office, then going back to home, then back to the office, suddenly having children at home, trying to do their schooling, perhaps your salary has been cut. There are these multiple different losses that you are experiencing all the time. And have a look at some of them. Maybe this starts to resonate with you. There's been a sense of loss in familiarity, especially for people who really liked working and liked their work routine. They like to know that they can go to the office, park their car in a certain place, and that's them for the day. Their specific desk, they've got no interruptions, and that's their routine. That familiarity has all been lost. There's a loss of control in the sense that, especially if you're a leader or a boss, trying to manage your team without being able to physically see them if you're all doing remote working is a huge loss that this transition has suddenly evoked. There's a loss in resources, and this can be across the board for different people. It can be a loss of a job or a loss of an income. It could be loss of a part of an income. It could be loss of a basic service that you used to get. I've worked with people who often had people who came and cleaned their houses or looked after their children. But because of COVID, those services are no longer available. And that's a resource that then has been lost. A loss of perspective. At the moment, we are not thinking kind of what is going to be happening next year or the year after. We are just tracking in a single tunnel vision because we're leading in crisis management. And so our perspective has narrowed down completely. And we're just trying to think, especially in the heavier lockdown periods, which I know India has had, in fact, very similar to South Africa. We're just trying to think, how am I going to get through the next day with my work demands and my children, or with my work demands and managing my team, or the week ahead, no matter the month ahead or the remainder of the year. So our perspective has been completely distorted, as it does in a crisis. There's a loss in confidence because perhaps the things you were very good at were requiring you to be in person with people. Maybe you have wonderful people skills, but you have shocking IT skills. And suddenly now you're being forced to work from home using Zoom and Skype, and you're unfamiliar with this, and so your confidence has decreased. Or perhaps you've lost your job, and that's a huge confidence blow. And then, similar to a loss in perspective, there's a loss in planning. The ability to plan into the future is just not available the way it was 6 months ago. So these are just some, and I'm sure you can think of other losses that you've experienced, but these are the particular psychological impact of a year like COVID, where the transitions have been multiple and they've also never come to an ending, a reorientation position. So why am I highlighting all of this to you? Well, because as a psychologist and as a consultant with businesses, this is having a direct impact on your mental health or your psychological well-being. Here are just some general statistics to really highlight that point. If we have a look at Jordan, research from Jordan, and particularly with the student population, shows that depression has increased by 23.8% and anxiety by 18%. Let's look at the USA, where quite a big meta-study showed that the levels of anxiety and stress in adults and over 18 population has increased in 45%. If we have a look at the UK, they did a really extensive study that was available recently in their media, and they showed that irritation and sadness has increased by 50%. So sometimes when I talk about these words like depression and anxiety, people say, no, I'm not depressed and I'm not anxious. But when I say, have you been irritable? Have you been frustrated? Have you been sad more often than not? Then they can answer yes. And some of these statistics start to show that. Emotional exhaustion, 54% of the population surveyed said yes, they do feel emotionally exhausted. If we have a look at Italy, where we saw an incredibly difficult experience of COVID, especially in northern Italy, their PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a clinical diagnostic disorder, has increased by 37%, which is enormous. And their severe anxiety has increased by 20%. Let's bring it a little bit back home, because the majority of the audience today is based in India. There are kind of two pieces of interesting research that have come out of India so far. India received their first diagnosis on COVID on January 30th of this year, and the first big study was done in March 2020 of this year. These are some of the statistics that were shown from India. Sleep disturbances were up by 55.3%. People were feeling helpless and depressed, increased by 12%. Anxiety and restlessness increased by 7%. And this was a study that was done in Delhi in particular, so it was looking at only the Delhi population. Another piece of research looked at 64 different cities across India, and that showed that there was an increase in a severe psychological impact on people that were surveyed by 12.7%, which again is an enormous amount of people being impacted psychologically. So what is the byproduct, or what is the consequence of these types of impact? Well, it's burnout. Burnout is a phenomenon that's very often thrown around, but very often not given the kind of credibility or importance that perhaps it's due. It's a specific condition. It's not a diagnosis in the sense of depression or anxiety, because it doesn't have very set clinical criteria, but it's a specific condition that has been researched extensively by a professor called Dr. Maslash, and she's based at Berkeley University. She's spent her entire career looking at understanding burnout and has published multiple different papers on the topic. She describes it in a really simple way. She says that you want to think about a fire that has had its oxygen source deprived. So a fire that the oxygen has been capped and it no longer has the basic vital resources that it needs in order to continue to function. And when we think about burnout in people, we start to think about the same impact. It's people who are feeling like their basic resources or their basic needs are not being met sufficiently, and so they're starting to struggle to function or be effective. Her work highlights that when people are experiencing burnout, at best they become ineffective, and at worst they can actually become quite destructive because they can get so frustrated and so hostile. So that's a little bit of the background of burnout. But I think I want you to be able to leave here today with a sense of what is burnout, and how do I know if maybe I'm experiencing burnout or if a colleague or family member is. Dr. Maslash's research has highlighted that there are kind of 3 core pillars that you can start to think about the symptoms or the clinical criteria for burnout. The first is head, the second is heart or emotions, and the third is body. So this is where you almost want to play doctor to yourself and see if you can go through these lists and see, okay, I've got this one, and this one. Maybe I need to monitor this a little bit, and then we can think about some toolkits for you a little bit later. When we are talking about the psychological or the head impact of burnout, people with burnout start to experience these kinds of symptoms. They become far more doubtful. They're doubtful about themselves. They second guess their own actions. They're suddenly not nearly as confident in their ability to perform their job or perform their role as they might have been before. They can also become quite cynical. So they can become cynical about the workplace, they become cynical about colleagues, and they take almost a negative perception to things. They often have difficulty concentrating and difficulty in making decisions, which can really impact their work environment or their colleagues. They have a decreased sense of motivation, and they overall just have a negative perception about work. So those are the head symptoms. If we had to think about the emotional symptoms, there's normally either an increase in emotions, so people become more heightened in their emotions, or there's a decrease in emotions in the sense that people become quite numb and almost feel like they're completely withdrawn or detracted from other people around them. So people can start to experience emotional responses like anger, irritation, frustration. You say one small thing and they kind of blow up, where ordinarily they would never have reacted that way. In fact, I was in a meeting this morning with a leader who was saying that just the smallest little incidents are starting to upset her employees, and they're resulting in all these kind of mini micro conflicts where ordinarily there would never be incidents. And I think those employees are really starting to feel the impact of burnout. Another interesting emotional response is that sometimes people can become overcompensatory. So they become a little bit arrogant, or they feel very omnipotent. They almost become a know-it-all at the office. And that's a defense mechanism in response to feeling so unsure and so uncertain. People can also show signs of being suspicious. Again, that goes into their kind of doubtful, cynical, second guessing. They become a little bit more suspicious of leadership or the intentions of the organization or their intentions of their colleagues. So those are the heart or the emotional responses when you're experiencing burnout. And then there's the physical responses. The physical responses are the bodily responses that normally actually bring people into treatment, but they end up with a GP rather than with a psychologist at the first instance. Because what happens is that when you are experiencing high levels of stress, and it's ongoing stress, like we've had this year since March for many of us, our body starts to shut down. It just can no longer take the pace. It can no longer take those head and those heart emotions. And so we start getting headaches. We start getting very tired, even though we're sleeping for 8 hours or whatever it might be. Or we start having difficulty sleeping and waking up regularly through the night, struggling to fall asleep, battling with insomnia. We start to struggle with stomach pains or all sorts of these body ailments. And it's almost like our bodies are flagging to us, hey, something is not right. We need to slow down. I'm not coping. And so, like I said, these are normally the symptoms that bring people into treatment because they're the most tangible symptoms that something is going wrong. In some ways, it's a lot like working with children, especially children who don't have a verbal ability or a vocabulary. When a child is feeling hurt or upset, they often can't express that. And so they say, I'm feeling sore, or they get tummy aches because actually they're feeling quite anxious. It's a similar thing that happens to adults, just in a little bit more of a developed way. So these are the three big criteria in terms of thinking about burnout: head, heart, body. Have a look at that and see if any of those start to resonate with you. I think when you are looking at burnout in terms of yourself, you're looking at really a summary of it would be to say that you're feeling a level of emotional exhaustion, a level of decreased motivation or decreased sense of personal accomplishment, and some physical symptoms, as well as probably a sense of feeling a little bit detached from other people. And that's that numbing component where you just don't really want to spend time with other people, even though you used to previously want to. So those are the different criteria that you would be exploring within yourself. I worked with a leader who was quite a prominent academic here in South Africa, and she's a woman who is incredibly competent. She's at the top of her game. She produces an enormous amount of journal articles, and when COVID hit, it's almost as though she went into a state of paralysis. And she said to me, Tamryn, I don't understand. This is not me at all. I can't think. I can't concentrate. It takes me so much longer to get through an admin list that I normally would get through in the morning. I'm struggling to fall asleep. The leg pain that I used to have has started to return. And there's just this kind of ongoing sense of her own anxiety. And that was as a result of burnout. She tried to cope right through the beginning of the lockdown, but actually was feeling incredibly anxious about it. And then eventually all the symptoms came together. So there's no one person who's immune from this. Sometimes we look at people who are struggling and we say, oh, it's because they're weak or because they don't know how to take care of themselves. People at the top of their game, especially leaders, are very susceptible to experiencing burnout, and especially during this current crisis. So it would be no good for me to sit here and talk to you about burnout without giving you something practical and personal that you can take home. This would be my recommendation around a personal toolkit. If we had to think about how do you either overcome burnout if you're starting to experience it, or prevent burnout if you know that you're at risk of it, these would be 8 of the different criteria that I think would be worth focusing on. And the first one is to establish realistic expectations. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to cherry pick a few of them. But the ability to realign in terms of your expectations right now is very important. You're not going to be able to do the same amount of work that you used to. You're probably not going to be able to do it in the same fashion that you used to. And so setting realistic expectations for you and your household, especially if you've got children at home and you're trying to manage them if they're not back in school, is going to be really important. Give yourself new expectations and then allow yourself to feel a sense of accomplishment when you reach those, rather than beating yourself up for not meeting previous expectations in a pre-COVID world. Keep and set boundaries, and this is so important. I like this idea that was taken from Adam Grant, which is say yes. Every time you say yes to something, you are inherently saying no to something else. There's a lot of personalities who really struggle to say no, and because they feel like they're letting people down, or they feel a sense of guilt around saying no. But actually, every time you say yes to something, you are saying no to something else. You're just not choosing to acknowledge what it is that you're saying no to. So I'll give you an example. If you are choosing to help a colleague, but you know that you've got your own work deadline for 5 o'clock that evening, and you say yes to helping your colleague, what you're saying no to is getting your work in on time, and your personal kind of identity in terms of a career profile might be compromised. Now, it's very hard for you to acknowledge that in the moment, but I think a simple way for you to ask yourself, if you are someone who struggles to say no, is every time you say yes, what am I actually then saying no to? And if I were to evaluate that, is that worth the payoff? Is there another way to say, actually, I've got a deadline for 5 o'clock. I need to say no to you now, but I can say yes to you tomorrow because I've got capacity tomorrow. So set clear and realistic boundaries and then work hard to try and maintain them. Ensure that there's a sense of value alignment when your values conflict. So this is especially true for right now. People feel a level of burnout when what they believe is different to what they're doing. This is relevant in organizations where you believe you're part of an organization that is caring, helpful, altruistic, whatever it might be, and then you watch the organization act in a very different way during a crisis. And what that results in is in a level of cognitive dissonance where your mind and your values are at odds with each other, and that plays on your mind the whole time, and so it results in a level of emotional fatigue. So if you are feeling like your values and your actions are not aligning, you need to think about how you can get those to better align. Spot the takers amongst you. There are going to be different types of personalities around you, people that give, people that match in terms of their reciprocal, and people that take. Spot the people who you feel like every time you're meeting up with them or hearing from them, they're just wanting something from you, whether it's advice or a resource or input or insight. If you don't have capacity right now, if your bucket is empty, then there's nothing left for you to give. And every time people are around you taking and taking and taking from you, even if it's just your time, it's depleting your capacity to be able to function. It's almost like we're depriving you then of that oxygen in terms of your own fire, and you will end up burning out. And the last one I want to draw your attention to is think about how you can help. There are multiple different ways of helping, and sometimes we try to help in our full capacity in all the different options that we have available. If 3 people are coming to you all needing your help, try and think about where you can put in just the right amount or the minimal amount of impact to be able to get a good outcome, rather than going the extra mile for every single person, because you don't have the capacity to do that. You need to manage your own capacity in order to be able to help other people. If you are empty, no one is going to win in the long run. I want to draw your attention to when this goes wrong. And this is Beck's cognitive triad. It's a psychological formula that helps us to understand depression. Beck says that when our views of ourselves, our views of our environment, and our views of our future are all negative, we're more likely to experience depression based on his research. So if we think about ourselves at the moment, our future at the moment, because everything is so uncertain, is primarily probably negative for most people. So now out of 3 of those kind of corners, you've already got 1 that is negative. Think carefully about how you're feeling about yourself and your own self-esteem, and how you're feeling about your environment. Because if another one becomes negative, it's very likely that those 2 are going to topple that 3rd one, and you're going to end up with all 3 being negative. The good thing about this framework is that these kind of corners have a bit of a knock-on effect on one another. So if you have one that is positive, it can influence the other corner to become more positive, and then the 2 can influence the 3rd. So if you're starting to feel yourself going into something a little bit more of a depressive space, ask yourself, am I feeling low because of my future? Am I feeling low because of myself? Or am I feeling low because of my environment? And what can I do specifically in that area to be able to address it? This is another framework that I think would be really helpful. And this is something that has come out of a group of research called positivist psychology. Yes, that's true. It's a group of people, or an entire department of people, who have focused on thinking, how do we help people become happier? And in their research, they realized that there are 3 important criteria that you need in order to feel a sense of happiness. And I've taken the liberty to add a 4th based on my own practical experience. So those 3 criteria is that you want to have a sense of self-competence. You want to have a sense of autonomy, so a sense of independence, or that you get to manage your own environment to some extent. And you want to have a good sense of relationships. You need to feel connected to people, whether that's work colleagues, family, or friends. Those are the first three. The fourth one is exercise, because exercise has a hormonal response and a physical response on your body. And remember, when we're thinking about burnout, we're also thinking about your bodily experience. So exercise is actually really important. Again, if you find yourself feeling quite low or quite burnt out, think about it in terms of these four categories. Am I feeling like I'm not very competent at the moment? And if you're not feeling competent, then what can you do to start making yourself feel a little bit more competent, things that you're good at? It might be returning to a hobby or starting to do something at work that you used to do that you know that you're really good at. Find the things you know you can master. Am I feeling like I don't really have any control, which probably makes sense for a lot of you right now? Then think about, all right, even in this very uncertain context, what are the things that I can control and how do I move towards those? Even if they're the small things, like setting up a schedule for how you're going to work at home, when is going to be your rest time, when is going to be your exercise time, and then sticking to that. Ask yourself whether you feel like you are connected to other people. Do you have a good sense of relationship right now? Or has lockdown and COVID severely impacted your relationships? How do you then build those relationships back in, despite some of the challenges that we're facing around in-person contact? And then ask yourself, how much exercise am I getting in a weekly basis? This doesn't have to be extreme. It can literally be going for a walk in your area, or it can be doing basic exercise at home. But those four criteria are really important. I want to pay attention now specifically to leaders, because I think leadership itself has had to fundamentally change in terms of managing this crisis. And this is a wonderful quote by Daniel Goleman, who works extensively with emotional intelligence, which I told you earlier I'm really interested in. And I think what it highlights is that the emotional intelligence of the leader is really significant in terms of helping people, teams, and the entire organization come through this pandemic. And so why I think that that is so important is that leaders need to have developed their own sense of self-awareness. And self-awareness is the ability to know what triggers you, to know how you act under stress, to know what are the kinds of things that are really going to frustrate you and what is your reaction going to be. Leaders who have done some self-awareness work are able to then regulate themselves, so they don't respond out of panic. They don't respond out of that fight, flight, or fright mode. They are able to actually respond in a calm, rational, and reasonable way. When you're able to do that, you're able to understand that you're going to have to do something different to motivate yourself, and that what motivates you as the leader is going to be different to what motivates a team member. It's going to allow you to have a heightened sense of empathy, which is incredibly important during a pandemic, as are social skills. And so Goleman's work in terms of developing emotional intelligence has highlighted to us that leadership is 2/3 people management, which means it's 2/3 emotional intelligence management, and only 1/3 technical skill. We're very often promoted to leadership because we're very good at our jobs, and we get there and then we realize that actually we're doing very little technical elements of our job. We're actually managing people and conflict and crisis a lot more often. And that's why the emotional intelligence of leaders is so important. If you're a leader, here is a bit of a toolkit for you. There are 10 different things that I think would be worth almost screenshotting if you've got your phone with you, that you should be paying attention to as we go through this pandemic. The first is resolve your guilt around resting. A lot of the leaders that I've spoken to have felt like they can't afford to take leave. They can't afford to step out of the kind of work office hours earlier and have proper rest, or take weekends, or even one day on the weekend. And as a result, our leaders are burning out faster than our general employees. So leaders, resolve your guilt around resting. You are just as vulnerable to burnout as everybody else. And if you're not taking proper rest, you are going to burn out. And then again, no one in your organization stands to benefit. The other aspect that I think is important for leaders to monitor is around increasing supervision and training, and establishing work support groups. People during a pandemic need more hands-on treatment. What I mean by that is that sometimes people are going to need a little bit more of a directive leadership intervention, which might mean that they're going to need extra supervision or just extra training to help them feel more competent and in control of their environment. Other ways that you can do that is to allow support groups, and I've had some organizations who have set up a COVID debrief group where people are invited to come and sit and talk about how COVID has impacted their workspace or their personal space. They've got in an external psychologist who facilitates some of these forums, and they happen kind of once a month or once every 2 weeks, which has just allowed people the opportunity to debrief their psychological concerns so that they can refocus on their work concerns. What it's done is it's improved a sense of organizational loyalty. It leaves employees feeling like they're being taken seriously and being heard and taken care of. And because of both of those, they're actually working with higher levels of productivity. So there's a direct ROI for leaders to take that initiative. The other thing to do for leadership is to know when to say no. And the idea I wanted to present to you here is to think about becoming almost like a triage nurse, a nurse in an emergency room. These are people who get confronted with intense crises on a day-to-day basis, but they don't jump in and try and take it all on board. In fact, they are specifically trained and skilled to be able to stand back first, which is that regulation that we were talking about in terms of emotional intelligence, to get the information, to then assess what is the urgency here, who is going to be best equipped to take this forward, what are going to be the short-term interventions to save this life, versus the long term. And the most difficult question is, should I be intervening at all? And at some points they have to make the decision that actually to intervene is going to cost more resources and more energy than they would be able to sustain. And then they have to stand back. And those are some really, really tough decisions that those men and women have to make on a daily basis. It's similar in leadership. There are going to be situations that actually you're not going to be able to intervene on, or situations that other people need to take over rather than you. So being able to learn how to kind of hold that boundary, to know when to step in as the leader and when to stand back and allow other people to manage it, or to let that situation take care of itself, is going to be crucially important. I think it's also important to communicate often. People in a crisis need to hear messages of consistency over and over again. Have a weekly check-in with your staff, or as the leader, give out a weekly email. Even if there's no new news, say that. People need to know that there's still somebody who's monitoring and somebody who will deliver the news. So often I've had leaders saying, but I've got nothing to say, nothing's changed in the last week. So what's the point of doing this conversational broadcast? The point is that your team don't know that, and they feel comforted and psychologically more secure just by being told, actually, there's no new news and we are continuing as normal. So think about who's doing the communication in your organization. Is it being done calmly? Is it being done consistently? And can it be done slightly better? But that's a crucial component not to drop. The last is around showing compassion. At a time like this, the organizations that are flourishing are those who have leaders who are emotionally intelligent enough to show empathy, and then have the social skills to help their people manage this crisis in a compassionate kind of way. There's a human element to this pandemic that I don't think we can afford to lose sight of, especially if we are the leaders of the organization. So think about, how can I show compassion through this time to my people and to my teams? As a closing thought, whether you're a leader or an employee or a student or someone who's no longer working at all in this webinar, I want to draw your attention to this. This was a piece of wisdom that came from a professor at a university in South Africa who's done extensive work on resilience specifically. And she says one of our greatest assets in times of difficulty or strife is to remember that we have faced difficulty before. So use your memory to think, when last did I face something really, really difficult? How did I overcome it? What did I need? Who did I lean on? And remind yourself that you actually have the ability to get through this, because even though you haven't faced a pandemic before, you have faced multiple other stresses. And I'm sure if you gave yourself a few minutes to think about them, you'd be surprised at how resilient and how competent you actually managed to navigate those spaces. I'm going to give you 3 reflection questions as well, just to kind of take a photograph of these and start to think about them as we draw this webinar to a close. But this is going to help you to start to think about where you've used memory as a bit of a tool of resilience as well. When have you last come or experienced burnout? What was the context? What were the triggers? How did you manage it? Where are you your most playful? What does playfulness look like for you? And playfulness is important because in times of high stress, it's actually a de-stressor. If the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do, which is a quote by consultant Michael Porter, then what have you, especially as the leader or a manager, said no to, either personally or professionally, in the last 2 weeks? And very quickly you'll realize if you're a personality who struggles to say no, you'll struggle to answer that question. And maybe it's time for you, starting from tomorrow when you wake up, to make sure that every day you just say no to something in order to say yes to taking care of yourself through this pandemic. So I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention and your patience. I look forward to any questions that you might have as we go into the question and answer part of the seminar. And these are my information details. If you would like to get in contact with me, or you find that this conversation has been really helpful and you want to bring it into your own organization or learn more about executive coaching or working with your emotional intelligence, please don't hesitate to get hold of us. Vicky is the administrator at Tomorrow Today, and she will very gladly support you or respond to any queries or questions that you might have. Otherwise, Rakesh, I'm back over to you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Super. Thank you so much, Tam, for such a lovely, insightful, and thought-provoking session. I think in these difficult times, there could have been nothing better than thoughts that you've shared with all of us. And like me, I'm sure a lot of our audience who were tuned in found this very useful, especially the toolkits that you mentioned. I think a lot of our audience is people, the people manager, their leaders, and I'm hoping that they made copious notes of what you mentioned. Even if that was not the case, they can always go back to the recording and just do reference to what you shared, Tam. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and the experience you had in this field. Very, very useful. So I'm going to dive into the questions. I see a bunch of questions on my screen, Tamryn, but let me start with the first question that I have, and I will sort of start from where you left on the subject of leadership. So this obviously totally unprecedented situation for anyone of us, all the leaders also out there, right? And it's such a prolonged adversity, quarterly targets, cost pressure, so much of negativity. You have to take tough decisions and so on and so forth. It's possibly not the best time to be a leader. So my question to you, Tam, is what is your suggestion from the work that you have done? How do you suggest leaders to stay authentic in these times and also deliver to the agenda that they have been tasked to deliver on?
That's such a great question, Rakesh. And I think that leaders who are emotionally intelligent know that staying authentic is actually so important in terms of building that relationship with their employees. I would encourage leaders to be doing some kind of public broadcast to their teams, and in those, not acting like everything is fine. So not pretending that there's a state of denial or that everything is kind of rainbows and sunshine, but really paying attention to where the difficulties sit. Sometimes it can be helpful, depending on the context, for leaders to share a little bit of their own personal difficulties. So they might say something like, I'm also working from home. I've got 3 kids and they're all in the home because schools haven't opened, and it's really hard for me to concentrate. Sometimes just sharing that little bit of personal disclosure helps other people to relate to them. It comes across as genuine and authentic, and it just bolsters that sense of trust in leadership. But it's a difficult balance for leaders to get in terms of making sure that they do maintain that sense of the agenda that needs to be done. Because for many leaders, they still face a bottom line at the end of the day. And so managing that tension is difficult, which is why often leaders in these types of situations are actually feeling incredibly lonely, because they don't necessarily have someone that they can turn to for support. And if that is the case, then getting a coach or getting an executive coach to help you manage just through this crisis as your own debrief space might be really helpful as well.
Thank you, Tam, for that. I'll take this next question from Rajat. Tam, and the question is as follows. When it comes to dealing with people and building trust, which is so important, especially in these times, especially when people are all working from remote, there is no physical interaction that most people are experiencing as it used to be the case in past. Um, when it comes to building trust, is an apology more powerful than a thank you?
I guess that depends on what the offense was. I think leaders who can be humble enough to apologize when there has been something that has gone wrong, and again, it could be as simple as they didn't communicate effectively, goes a long way in establishing trust and building relationship. So yes, an apology can be very, very powerful because it translates the humanness of the leader, and that's what people are wanting to see at the moment. They want to see that people are relatable and can understand their context. So apologies can be really helpful. Just being authentic, I think, as leaders can be really helpful. You know, at Tomorrow Today, we say that leadership comes out of two pillars. You lead it out of who you are. That trying to be a different kind of leader is not going to work. You lead essentially out of who you are and your own personality, and that leadership is context specific. So those are the two pillars. And right now, the context is one of crisis, and you're leading out of who you are. And if that means that in your own personal experiences, you've made a blunder, apologize for it. Take off that mask of trying to be the bravado leader and be the leader who's able to kind of own up to a mistake, because it'll make it far more likely that your employees will be able to do the same thing if that is being mirrored to them. An apology doesn't make you weak. Actually, an apology can make you very strong in the eyes of your employees. And so being able to convey both that kind of boldness in terms of we are going to get through this, but also the gentleness and the humility of I know that I've made mistakes and I'm sorry for that, or thank you for staying with us, becomes really important. And I think Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand highlights that balance really well.
So I couldn't agree more with you on that, Tam. The next one is from Saksham, and I sort of expected this to be a question that a lot of people would ask, and I think that's why now it's appearing on my panel. And Saksham wants to know, how do you really remain positive and happy when everything around you seems to be really sinking, from job to relationships to finances and your own health. So how do you really cheat those feelings and go on the other side and start feeling good about the situation when actually it's not?
I think that comes down to perspective again, Rakesh. And I think that it's easy for me to say remain happy or focus on the positive, but the reality is that's slightly kind of in denial or an idealistic response to this. I think this is an incredibly tough time. The United Nations predicted that depression would be the leading cause of disability by the year 2030, and I feel like the year 2020 has accelerated that hugely. We are going to see an increase in depression. We are going to see an increase in anxiety because this context is incredibly dire. And if you looked at that triangle and realized actually myself, environment, and future are all negative, you're probably in a borderline dangerous space. So if you're in that space, I would recommend that you get some professional help or support to help you manage it effectively. And that could be psychotherapy treatment, it could be counseling, it could be seeing a psychiatrist. if you're not feeling like you at that point, but you are feeling like the impact is quite severe, I think you need to talk to people. You need to be able to talk to a friend or a colleague, or ask if you can have some kind of debrief spaces at work that could be made available to you, because talking in itself is a form of cure. It doesn't make the problem go away, but it does alleviate the psychological burden of the problem. And hearing other people's experiences can often help put your experiences into perspective. So it's not about us thinking, how can we kind of make this happy and see the silver lining? It might be around going, all right, finances are going to be a mess. My mood is very low, but maybe I can find an area that I can be a little bit more competent in. Maybe I can manage my finances. And even though they're low, I'll feel a level of self-confidence increase because I know I'm managing it well. So in these kind of times, you really want to move towards what are the areas that I can control and how do I control them? Because that in itself is going to alleviate anxiety.
Okay, the next one is from Radhika, and I think she is a mother of two teenagers. And the question is that, um, see, there is so much happening. How do you really engage your teenagers at this time when they're not getting to step out? How do you really spot whether they are getting into depression? Because there are fights happening, but how do you really spot the signs of depression, if at all, you should be watching out for?
Yeah, I think this is really tough for teenagers. You know, we hear talking mostly about the workplace, but I see a lot of teenagers in my private practice, and even amongst the colleagues that I work with, we've been discussing that for teenagers, because of their developmental life stage, this kind of experience has been really detrimental for them. Teenagers flourish under social situations. They are kind of driven from a developmental perspective right now to be socializing, to be finding their identity in a social space. Sometimes that's through extended family, if you have a very big family network, but most often it's through their school and through their peers. A lot of teenagers find their sense of identity through going to school and the routine of going to school, being successful at school, being successful in the sports field if they play cricket or any kind of extramural. And if we think about lockdown, what lockdown did was it took away the stability of school, it took away the routine, it took away all the extramurals, which is also a physical outlet for teenagers' emotion and frustration, and it took away all of their friends and the ways in which they normally interact with their friends. Now, I did it for all good reasons, and I'm not refuting that at all, but I am saying that there has been a psychological impact on our adolescents that maybe we are not factoring in as adults. I think if you are a parent of a teenager and you're worried about them at the moment, you need to talk to them. Talk to them about those different categories that this presentation has presented to you. Ask them about where they're feeling their sense of competence, autonomy, relationship, and exercise, and which of those four that maybe you can better support them in getting out more or becoming more successful in. Again, if you're worried about them, get some professional help or seek some professional support. But where possible, try and allow them to socialize. Let them see friends or let them be in communication with friends, and just be gentle with them. You know, our teenagers, they haven't learned how to emotionally regulate themselves the way that we expect adults to. And so they really do struggle to make sense of what is it that they're feeling and how do they express it, which very often comes out in an angry, irritable, or pushing of the boundaries. But they're struggling too. Talk to them about the potential for burnout. Have direct, open, transparent conversations with your teenagers. It's probably what they need the most, actually.
Thanks, Stan. No, Mandy wants to know that I'm facing a sudden loss of creativity in my work. So, is that related to burnout, or is there a sign or something that I should be wary of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the symptoms of burnout, and it would fall under the decreased sense of motivation. And creativity allows a certain psychological freedom, which is why playfulness in the workplace is so important. And I don't mean playfulness the way children play. I mean a sense of people feeling like they can experiment with things. It's why Google has that experimental 20% in their work week, because when people feel like they are freed up and they are loose of responsibility to be able to play with concepts and ideas, they actually generate higher levels of productivity and increased levels of novel thinking or innovative ideas. When we think of our current climate, we are not afforded that opportunity to just kind of relax in our minds. There's so much that is running through our mind all the time. The work environment has changed so fundamentally that it's hard for us to actually feel safe and secure, even psychologically or mentally in our work, which makes it much harder to then just relax into it and play in it, which is what creativity is. So I think that there's a contextual reason for why you have a decreased sense of creativity in your work. Watch that it doesn't start to impact your motivation, and I would just start to monitor those other symptoms that I gave around burnout. And if you start to notice that actually you're kind of hitting a lot more of those criteria, then maybe it's time to get some support.
Right. A shout out to our audience. We got last couple of minutes, maybe two more questions, Tam, before we sort of hit the buzzer on the time here.
Sure.
Geeta wants to know, you said something very relevant, and I think I can really relate to it, especially in our country, where there is a tendency to say yes to everybody and mostly authority, right? It could
Right.
be home or it
Yes.
could be work. So you mentioned that saying yes, when you say yes, you're actually saying no to some other things.
Mm-hmm.
But in these uncertain times when you are feeling insecure about your
Mm.
job and all that is
Mm.
happening, saying no doesn't seem to be the smartest strategy. So that being the case, how do you really start on this journey of saying no without causing any, harm to yourself?
Yeah, great question. I think it's difficult at the moment, but I think you can start in small ways. So if you're a person who generally struggles to say no, just start saying no to one thing. It might be saying no to putting your phone on before a certain time, because the moment you put your phone on, you know that those requests are going to start coming through. So it might say, all right, I'm going to say yes to giving myself an extra 30 minutes to connect with my family or to do exercise or to lie in bed and prepare myself for the day, rather than saying yes to putting on my phone. Start with the smallest, kind of most basic things that you can. Say yes to not eating your lunch or your dinner in front of your computer, but rather eating it with other people or eating it just by yourself, so that you have a break or a separation from your work. Then you start to build up slowly. Say no to people that you think the consequence would be less intense. And often it helps to explain to them why you're saying the no. So you can say to them, one of the difficulties that people say to me is, I can't say no because then I feel guilty because the other person's not going to understand. But very often we say no without giving an explanation, which does make it difficult for the other person to understand. So when someone asks you for something and you know you haven't got capacity, you can say no, but say no or say no why. So I can't help you with this because I need to do X, Y, and Z, so that they have a far bigger context or a better perspective about why you're saying no. And then if you do have capacity at a later point, you can say to them, but I will be able to take it on Tuesday, or I will be able to do this part of it, but not that part of it because of X, Y, and Z. So just help people get that sense of context, and that often alleviates a lot of the aggression or hostility that you anticipate you might receive as a backlash.
Great, thank you, Damon. I think the last question before we draw the curtain on the show for today is we've got a large section of our audience, either students or young executives who've just started their career a couple of years in their jobs, and they are looking at all this uncertainty. So, what would be your advice to them when they are thinking of their career and navigating through this crisis?
Sure. That's a tough one because I think it's probably so dependent on their specific industry and where they're at in their career. I think my advice would probably be to go back to what I said earlier, which almost feels like the second pillar of burnout, which is loneliness. And I'm noticing that a lot of leaders are feeling really lonely in knowing how to navigate this. So my advice would be that if you are feeling like that, if you as a leader are feeling quite stuck, reach out to either a fellow friend of yours who might be a leader in a different organization and just meet, almost as kind of like a mentoring conversation between the two of you, where you have lunch and just talk about how is your organization coping through this and how are you as a leader coping through this. If you haven't got access to anybody like that, then I think it would probably be worth getting an executive coach just for 3 sessions. You're not signing yourself up to therapy, which can feel whatever it might feel, but get an executive coach or contact Tomorrow Today and let us help you navigate that, either through kind of 2 or 3 sessions where we can talk about where you're at and what might be the next helpful steps, or by thinking at a bigger level, what might your organization need to hear next and how can we help you deliver that. So that would be my advice, that as the leader, it's okay to ask for help in this regard.
Super. I think that was for a very broad-based question, Tam. It was very fine advice, and and I would completely endorse that. Find yourself a mentor. There are a lot of people out there who can really help you through this situation because they've gone through the situations in the past themselves. So great. Thank you very much, Tam, for being with us, for sharing so openly. It was an absolutely delight to have you with us on the show today. I'm sure all of us have learned a lot from the session today. So thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for being with us, and we want you to stay safe.
Thank you very much, and likewise, it was wonderful to be here. So thank you for the opportunity, and stay safe on your side as well.
Thank you, Tam. All right, so that's the end of today's session. Um, Before we sign off, couple of things. I need to announce the 2 lucky winners. So the lucky winners for today, I'm seeing on my screen. Okay, Sham for asking the question on, how do you really uh, connect when you are not really in a physical space? And the second one is from Geeta for asking the question on, how do you really start saying no? So congratulations, Sham and Geeta. Please leave your email IDs in the comments box so that we can hand you over the vouchers. And thank you everyone for being on the show today. I also have to thank our community support partners, Resulticks, Adgully, Paul Writer, and Shoolini University for being with us and spreading the message. The next session we have is on 21st October, 6:30 with Marty Valletta. Don't forget to tune in and stay with us and stay safe. Thank you very much for joining us today.